I think the concept of vibe coding makes no sense. I'm just going to type stuff into an agent and what comes out is like what comes out. It's still software engineering. You're still designing systems, writing specs, making sure the tests are good, code review. And so our customers are devs. So we think a lot about what's changing and how they build software. Are there new developers? Do the new developers have different sort of needs? Can we use new technology? And this isn't new to AI. It's like any kind of technology. And so Sentry has a ton of data. And what we do is we effectively compress and summarize a lot of that data, feed it into an LLM. That LLM has a bunch of tools similar to all these agents, like read source code, and they can come up with an analysis of this using those tools and that data. We're able to feed it in there. I would say historically we have a moat in the sense of we have so much interconnected data about the application itself, whereas a lot of other vendors that do application monitoring, they operate at a different level.
You haven't written code by hand in the last 6 weeks, but you're shipping production systems on it. What does your development process look like right now?
So first, I want to start with a very important concept.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the AI Native Dev. Thanks for tuning back in. Today, we'll have a fun conversation that talks about developing with AI from these sort of two angles. One is from a slightly, I don't know if it's contrarian or pioneering perspective of how to build with AI, and the other is from building tools into AI, which I guess is also a pioneering frontier in its own right. And to cover all of those or talk about those, we have with us David Cramer, who's probably best known as the co-founder of Sentry, which is a tool I've always very much sort of appreciated a lot of the DevX sensibilities and usefulness of it, and with some sort of deep developer background prior to that. David, thanks for coming onto the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Looking forward to this.
So maybe just to get us started, can you give us a little bit of background about yourself and then maybe about Sentry, just mostly from the context of this is the world in which you're experimenting with AI, and so how what is it that you're learning all around you?
Yeah, we've got I and we as in Sentry have a pretty wide breadth of concerns. So like obviously there's Sentry is a dev tool, and so our customers are devs. So we think a lot about what's changing and how they build software. Are there new developers? Do the new developers have different sort of needs? Right now, I would say not really. But then there's also the angle of like, can we use new technology? And this isn't new to AI. It's like any kind of technology shift, but like, can we use it to build new or different software? And there's also sort of like the green field of like, should we be building something completely new that's not just like sort of incrementally adding to Sentry software? And then I think the last piece, which has probably been the more interesting topical piece as of, the recent months, which is like, how does it actually change your job? Like, how can you leverage a technology to say, higher shipping velocity or something of that nature? And I personally spent a lot of time on that front of like, sort of exploring the tools. Like I'm not an academic by any means. I'm like a self-taught software engineer, but I think of myself as a really good applied engineer in the sense of like, I don't know anything about the academics. I roughly know like what a Markov chain is. But I'm very, very good at like debugging software and like figuring out how things work. And so I've just spent a lot of time like really in the weeds of like, okay, like, how can you push this and use it to the maximum effectiveness, which to be fair is like the same way you would learn how you might apply it to like, say your product or a new product or something of that nature.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is, it's the practitioner view, right? You're sort of learning by doing and you're bringing in the competency, right? Like I think in software, we oftentimes, there's a blending of the world of like, I'm building dev tools and I'm using dev tools, which is actually like a privilege that we have that we often forget is a privilege. When you're building tools for lawyers, oftentimes the people building it are not lawyers themselves. And so there's this split here. So it's sort of things like you're coming in from the practitioner perspective, you have some subject matter, maybe you have a little bit less familiarity with the underpinnings of how the AI math operates, but you see it in practice. So I guess, in that context, we have these two topics here to cover. One is just sort of understand a little bit with that sort of Sentry lens, what it is that you are building as you're kind of experimenting with bringing value to your user base, or like using LLMs to do so. And then the other lens is just you've been doing some really interesting things around how you build software yourself and how you minimize the manual typing of that coding. Maybe we start a little bit with the Sentry side, just so that we can relate then your practices to maybe things that you've built. Can you tell us a couple of interesting things you've built? Appreciating these are all kind of early stage or like a fast moving changes. but that seem useful around how do you apply LLMs to Sentry to make it better for its users.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the first thing we built, which is, and actually time is fuzzy. First we had COVID, and now we have like this AI thing where like it's moved pretty fast. So I don't know, call it a year ago, we took embeddings. And so Sentry's core technology, it isn't much of it. It's like, we're a big enough company these days, so it's not that simple. But if you try to simplify it as much as possible, we capture errors, we put them in a dashboard, and then we do a bunch of like sort of processing in between those phases. And one of the things we do that's really critical is deduplication. And that comes from what we call fingerprinting, which generally is like a lot of regular expressions or something equivalent to regular expressions historically. And one thing we found pretty early with embeddings, adjacent, was we can actually improve our deduplication with embeddings quite drastically. And so, for example, the way a lot of this works is like, you'll go into like a programming language, take Ruby, and Ruby will have anonymous functions in the programming language, and they have like random integers inserted into the function names or something like this. It's been a while, so it might have changed, but this is what I recall. And so you end up writing a lot of these rules to parse those things out so they actually match together because they have to be static. Embeddings actually let you get much closer, from lower total work. And they're not enough on their own for what it's worth. But so we applied that and saw like massive improvements early on. And we're like, okay, that's cool. And that's how we think about it for what it's worth. It's not like, oh, what's the cool gimmick? We're like, we are a real business that is like going to sustain, and we want to like real applications. And so that was a great early application. More recently, and the thing that actually impressed me, and so we're like, okay, how do we apply LLMs? And in our space, generally speaking, in dev tools, I think the most exciting thing about LLMs is just like code generation, right? Because like if you can generate code and understand code, there's a lot of really interesting things. And that's one area that is like basically not approachable before. Whereas like fingerprinting, yeah, we could solve it forever. It's just a lot of tedious work. Code generation, not a chance, And so early on, we're like, okay, what's adjacent to Sentry that we could apply this tech to? And we're like, okay, what if we could actually sort of automatically fix bugs or automatically generate tests or something along those lines, right? And let me preface this with, you can't reliably do that today. So this is more of like, what if we can get there, which is really important. I think that's the way to work. And so we started building something in the space, and the thesis was Sentry has a lot of data. I would say historically we have a moat in the sense of like, we have so much interconnected data about the application itself, whereas a lot of other vendors that do sort of application monitoring, they operate like at a different level. They operate like at the system level or something. It's just not, the data is just kind of junk. Like have you ever looked at like something like Splunk or like a log aggregator and you look through the logs, you understand what I mean.
Because it's just dump all the data in as opposed to some form of qualification, proper curation of it.
Yeah, and ours is like highly structured, highly semantic. And we're like, you know what? Let's try like interlinking all this data, which this is pre-LLMs to be fair. And so we made this trace connected data set. And then we're like, you know what? I wonder like if we could throw this into LLMs because it's effectively pattern matching. And they do a really good job at large scales of data. What would come out of it? Like how well could it help us diagnose things? And we're building this actually for probably the better part of the last year we've been working on this. And this is our thing called Seer, S-E-E-R, if you've seen it. But I remember a few months back, I'm like, can we ship this yet? It's been so long. And I'm like, it probably doesn't work still. Because if you've used any of these tools, they like just make up, like they hallucinate, if you will, because they just don't have the right information. And so I remember going in and there was a JavaScript bug on one of my side projects. And I'm like, look, let me show you why this technology is a problem. It's not going to be able to understand what's going on here, no matter what. Like I can't understand it. I'm an expert in this. And I run the thing. It gives me some like really wacky root cause. And that's the main thing it does is root cause analysis, not patch generation. The patch generation is whatever. But it comes with the root cause. The root cause makes no sense to me. And I showed it to the team. I'm like, look, this is completely wrong. This is why it's not ready. The next day, somebody at our company is like, okay, I hit this bug. And they show me like the actual error. And I don't remember exactly the details, but I'm like, oh, that's what it said the problem was. And like, it was actually right. And I was genuinely impressed because what I will tell you, my singular belief is the reason an engineer is valuable, like go to like a big company like a Google and you have these staff principal engineers that get paid lots of money. A lot of times they're not doing that much in terms of actual outputs. And for a long time in my career, I'm like, well, why? It doesn't make any sense, And I have a lot of friends that have these jobs and they're very cushy. And then I eventually came to reason about like the value of that is their knowledge of the system and their ability to like theory craft around what's going on and thus to debug the system very, very fast. And And this can actually do that pretty well. I was like genuinely shocked. And so we spent a bunch of time building this. We're still working on it. It's still super early. Like just like all these things, it doesn't work that well. But when it works,
I think so I love the notion of like digesting substantial volumes of data, especially when you have it and you have it well structured on it, is I think like a superpower that's sort of been acknowledged. And you're right that one problem is hallucinations. Like it will give you an answer even if it is making it up pretty creatively. Another problem is kind of managing the context window, right? Of like which bits of the data do you deliver, right, to be analyzed on it? I don't know, like, was that problem an issue? I guess in general, what were the obstacles to getting it to work? And do you have any insights on almost like the practice or the methodologies that you think it's the same skills that sort of help to build or make this product actually effective, versus which are new skills that people on the team needed to build up?
honestly, I think a lot of the skills were the same. Like there was this era, early LLMs. So the industry has always been this way. There's academia, and then there's the real world, is how I would describe it. And I remember the era of NoSQL databases where academia was always present. It's like, oh, maybe we found a new way to scale databases, and it would never work. It could never work in practice because systems are really large and really complex and infrastructure is hard, et cetera. That's the same right now. And so when this all started, it was mostly like data scientists, like building with LLMs, and there were DAGs and all these complicated workflows. And then very quickly, it started to evolve. And now for example, the common pattern today is an agent, which is just a service. We just renamed service to agent for some reason. And it has a bunch of tool calls, which are just RPC calls, to something, whether it's internal RPC or external RPC. And I actually think we are still a little bit legacy with our workflow for this. It might still be like effectively like a pipeline or whatever these early terms were. It looks more like a DAG, a graph call. But generally speaking, it's a lot of, like, the way I always articulate the best way you can leverage technology today. And I think this is important because, like, if you listen to this a year from now, who knows? Yeah. It's like MapReduce. So it's like you have a lot of information. Can you compress it in a way that isn't losing the most vital parts? And then can you repeat that process until you get the outcome you need? And so Sentry has a ton of data. And what we do is we effectively compress and summarize a lot of that data, feed it into an LLM. That LLM has a bunch of tools similar to all these agents, right? Like read source code. I don't actually remember what else is in there, but that was really important. And then can it come up with an analysis of this, using those tools and sort of that data, we're able to feed it in there. And from there, and I think this is true with everything you try to do these days, it becomes like questionably scientific in the sense of you're like, does this kind of look better? Right. Does this seem like it would be better? Like it's so non-deterministic that it's actually like really painful to work with when you're trying to improve it. And obviously we have things like evals that help, but it's still, I feel like it's still just like, you're mostly banking on model improvements at the end of the day, and the tool chain being effective, of course. Like that is really, really important, and the data being like high quality and high signal and stuff. But it is a lot on the model ultimately. I do find it entertaining. Where on one hand, like what has evolved substantially is these calculations of massive numbers and math to really encodes data in a very mathematical, very precise way to create these massive models and like spend billions of dollars training them. And on the other side, you have vibe coding. It looks right. I'm going to ship it. Yeah. I can build this feature. So maybe this is a good time to shift a little bit. So thanks for the taste of it of some of the learnings and opportunities that you're seeing in Sentry to bring kind of LLM powers to the forefront. I'm sure there's many more. But let's talk a little bit about your development flow. So when we spoke before, you kind of gave me the statement that says that you haven't written code by hand in the last 6 weeks, but you're shipping production systems on it. Maybe take us a bit into this world. Like what does your development process look like right now? And maybe some of the early learnings from how it changed. First, I want to start with a very important concept. I think the concept of vibe coding makes no sense. Like this idea of like YOLO, if you will, like there's this whole thing of like, I'm just going to type stuff into an agent and like what comes out is like what comes out. It's still software engineering. You're still designing systems, writing specs, making sure the tests are good, code review and all this stuff. So I think that's really, really important to understand. But and unfortunately, I did have to write code like what day of the week is a couple days ago. because I couldn't get it to do the thing I
Streak.
needed. Yeah.
It needs to be
Yeah.
like
I
a
broke the
Duolingo
streak.
version now of
Yeah.
how many days have you gone without writing code?
This was about 8 weeks before I had to do it. And I spent like 4 days. And just so everybody understands, my full-time job is not really writing code, even though I actually do a little bit more for the company now. It's more like passion projects. So even on MCP service, which is a thing that I built and am maintaining, it's very valuable to the company right now, but it is effectively a side project. And it's a side project I'm helping maintain. But the MCP service, I wrote it by hand. On that particularly, the systems don't change. Software doesn't really change at the end of the day. And so if you can reason about how just software works, everything looks pretty similar. So MCP, I'm like, okay, it's a plugin architecture. It's how you integrate. It's a little bit of a flipped funnel. It's like I can build the integration and stick it anywhere, or a customer can stick it anywhere, which is like not typical when you think about cloud service integrations and things like that. To be clear, it has a lot of use cases. I'm very focused on how it applies to Sentry. And so as soon as they announced like the OAuth spec, I'm like, okay, I could extract value out of this now. I can insert Sentry into Cursor into Claude Code or something like that. And it's very, very high value. And so as soon as that happened, I quickly whipped up a prototype. Like Cloudflare was working on some MVP stuff as well. We pulled that in and like, I don't know, within a couple of days, we had something production ready or not. It's questionable these days. What is production ready? But it was working totally fine. And so I spent a bunch of time working on that. And if you use Sentry, definitely check it out. You can just drop in a link to a Sentry issue. It'll pull in the right context. If you use Seer, it'll pull in Seer's context as well. And the workflow is like, it's really, really, really good. And so it's a great experience. But when we think about it that way, it's not like we built a random Sentry everywhere integration. It's like, no, I built a thing that makes it highly functional to use Sentry inside of coding agents.
Right.
And it just happens to be an abstract protocol. And so that's how we think about the product.
It's effectively middleware, right? It's sort of it's middleware.
It's kind of like middleware. Yeah.
Because you needed the API, you needed the Sentry APIs to begin with to provide useful services. And then you have the client that already runs, and you're creating an interim layer that does the LLM world translation of here's some information, client, about when would you use me, and here's a means of converting that into the proper API call, and maybe converting the data back in.
I would say that's high level, but it goes deeper. Like I'll give you an analogy. MCP now actually has 2 agents embedded inside of it. And so a bunch of the MCP tool calls are just like, roughly translate this input to one or more API calls and then translate that output into one response. But now there's a couple search endpoints that exist inside of it. So like find errors or run. So Sentry does more than errors. It does logs and traces and all this stuff. And within logs and traces, particularly, you have a bunch of attributes. You might want to run functions on those aggregations, ask questions. So here's a really good analogy. In the in Claude or Cursor, I can say, what was the total token consumption of X service yesterday? And it can answer that through Sentry's MCP call. And that's not just like mapping that to like an API call. That's actually mapping that to a natural language input that then gets thrown inside of another agent that then gets mapped to API calls, if that makes sense. So I would say, yes, it's middleware. I mean, everything's middleware. But you can actually go a lot deeper if you really think about the product experience. And so that's where it gets interesting. And honestly, I think the future of a lot of this is just this like, it's like the embedded agents or agent-to-agent communication, because it's still a lot of natural language stuff. It's still non-deterministic. You can't expect it to randomly write API calls, So, but we spent a lot of time on that. And particularly, this is where I ran the experiment of like, could I not write code by hand ever again? And that was a lot of time. Like, can I like co-locate the right documentation? Can I write the right context prompts? Can I get all this stuff that will probably improve the system based on how the technology works? And the answer is like, yes and no. Sometimes it'll impress you, and then other times you're like, dude, just ignore everything. And so like, it was a really fun experiment, and we're not there yet, is what I would say. But the technology is really interesting. I would encourage everyone to try an exercise like this if they can. Like, one thing I will say is like, it will slow you down a lot of times doing it this way. And you should not think about doing it this way in like real world critical software. Like for Sentry's core code base, you do not write code through agents and only agents kind of thing. Like you might run an agent to generate a test or an API, and then you're going to go review, tweak that thing. And that's still a big performance improvement. Or to debug something, big performance improvement. This is like, I can kick it off, go to a meeting, come back. Maybe I've got a starting thing to run with, so I don't know. But either way, it's a useful exercise to learn the limitations of where we are today and to learn how you might improve upon those limitations, because that latter part, that's where I would absolutely bet is going to stay true. Again, because like software is pretty reliable. There's no magic in any of this. Like the way systems improve generally stays the same over time. They just get easier to improve or maybe need less of this kind of behavior. And so, but it's been a good learning experience.
Yeah. And first of all, it sounds we've actually done a couple of those versions here in Tessl. We sort of picked a couple of topics in which we build entirely agentic workflows, not to create the code, but actually systems that run entirely agentically as we assess software to create specs from it and the likes. And it's been it's bittersweet. You learn it. I guess what are some of the key maybe, I don't know if it's learnings or sort of insights, right? You're coming into this experiment, coming out 8 weeks later, like there's sort of two questions in my mind. One is, what do you believe now that you didn't believe before, right? Some conviction you've acquired. And two is, what did your job look like during that time? What were the primary things you did create by hand that you got better at over the course of these weeks?
I think importantly, like the workflow, just to understand what this looks like is you kind of start like, I want to solve a problem. Maybe you've got a ticket or something like this. And you really need to kind of get it down to like a really lightweight spec of some sorts. I don't write anything, to be clear. Like this is all generated, 100% of this. So it's like, even the spec is me describing and refining it. Like I actually think of like Sever. It's like, we're like, I forget what they call themselves, but you're sitting here just prompting over and over and trying to refine the thing, right? But doing it through human language, which sometimes is ineffective. And so I do that first, and then I get into implementation. And then usually what you find a lot of the time is it will do okay. And it really depends on the task for what it's worth. And it's not even about the size of the task. And you find a lot of like just FUD on the internet. It's just like people who don't actually build software don't know what the fuck they're talking about, frankly. It's not about the size of the task or any of this shit. It's about sort of the complexity in the task based on the commonality of the task. And so like, again, it's effectively pattern matching. And so it's like, if you're doing something that it can't easily find like common patterns where this lives next to this all the time, it just doesn't actually know what to do. So it's going to reach for another common pattern that looks like that. And so you'll find like a really good example where it went off the rails is when I started doing these embedded agents inside of the tools. It's an MCP tool, calling an agent, calling other tools. Good luck ever getting on the guardrails, because it gets so lost in words. Right? Which it is a confusing thing. I'm like, which tool is which,
Right.
And no matter how you try to steer it, it always ends up getting lost again because it's a very lossy compression at the end of the day.
Yeah, which interestingly is a human problem as well, right? If you were to sort of send your colleague this thing and you're using the word agent, in US fashion of it, you don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, and it doesn't help. And what I would tell you is, again, it's not simple versus complex. The implementation is unbelievably simple. And I can give it a full spec of exactly the architecture of how this works. It's really easy to reason about. It's just a chain of function calls. And it would just still go way off the rails. And then you get into these cycles where you try to get it to fix itself. And then my favorite analogy I give people, and this is a very good example of how you cannot control it with context management, is immediately when something goes wrong, it will try to insert the any type in TypeScript all the time, no matter how much you guardrail against using the any type. And so I have it in the Claude MV at the top of it, in the prompts, like critical, don't use this. And if you send that in every prompt, it's probably okay, but that's not how you work.
Right.
And I think that happens because of how common that is in the training data set. But again, I'm not an academic, so I don't know. But either way, it goes off the rails and then you sit here fighting with it. And this is the problem. This is where you waste time, and you shouldn't rely on like pure agent development because you are going to spend way more time trying to refine that thing through prompts than you would just opening the editor. And so I think, on one hand, that's not like it's kind of obvious that would be true, but you don't really know how frequently it's going to break. I would bet sub 10% of the time was I able to get like a one-shot fix in, without like serious refinement.
Right.
And even sub 10% where like one or two prompts got it correct. It's usually like 20 prompts to get something even remotely good. And again, this is real world software. I'm not just generating junk. I need it to be maintainable, testable.
Right.
And then if you don't review it, it's even worse because it will just, there was one I didn't review. And I thought I did, because I usually skim the stuff. where I was having it generate an
And you're working
integration
on
test.
side projects, so there isn't like a mandate of or like this is a specific project, and so it's not the team won't review it if you don't necessarily.
Kind of, yeah. We don't have the same controls on this, so we don't require the team to review it. But even so, humans make mistake too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so I actually review the code, but it's like I review the code and I'm not going line by line of everything. And there was one where I had to build an integration test and I thought I had reviewed it and made sure it was doing what I wanted to. And I went back to it and I found it was like inserting something random that was basically, it was not testing what I wanted it to test at all, and okay, it was fine. Like there were other things that checked this, but that's one of the fundamental problems. And so what I learned through this was, again, this is like what you should know, but there is like a very real thing. Like, don't be a pessimist is, I think, a really good rule. You need to kind of like, don't just assume truth in things, but you need to live some of these experiences. And so like part of this was me, I'm like, I'm going to try out Claude Code. It's a terminal-based UI. I don't know how well it's going to work. It's very impressive to be clear. Claude Code's like phenomenal as software.
Yep.
But I think my biggest learning, and something that a lot of the internet will be like, no, you don't know what you're doing, is like, Claude Code is actually not a great, like, this is the wrong user interface for where we are with this stage of technology. And what I mean by this is, if I use Cursor, ignoring the agent differences, because at the end of the day, the model is the main thing that's making the biggest impact. So the agents are close enough to the same. If I use Cursor and I run through their agent and I generate a change set, in real time, I'm getting the diffs in my editor. I'm able to approve blocks of code really seamlessly. I'm able to jump between these files really seamlessly. If I'm using Claude Code, I've got this like endless terminal slog. Yes, I can manually approve every single change and review it right there, but it is not easy to review it right there. You're reviewing like code additions, not the actual source code and things like this. And so my biggest, I think, point of view is like, that is wrong. That's not the right customer experience. Like, that is not a good product right now in terms of how it needs to be used by developers in real world software. I think Cursor is a much better experience for this kind of thing.
So what's the, I love the perspective of it, and I don't necessarily disagree. Like, I find this is like a learning exercise right now. I guess if you cast your eyes further, there's a claim that says, well, Claude Code needs to get better at explaining the changes that it has done because of this constraint of working through the terminal. And so, is it in a place in which it would improve its ability to engage with you without needing to review the code changes because of this interface? Or does it, I guess another lens is that it just commoditizes the idea. You don't really care if it's Cursor or the other. You just need some sort of lightweight integrations into the surrounding. Do those resonate, or do they come back to like, no, this like, there's a couple of years here at least, or a few years in which you're going to need to look at all the changes?
I think you're going to look at all the changes forever. I don't think this technology is enabling AGI or any of these things that people are spewing on the internet. They're not removing engineers. I spend as much, if not more time doing actual engineering work than ever before with this technology, because I am still designing a system. Like, these things aren't intelligent. They're just spitting out patterns, right? And ignoring the academics, because who cares? It's about like real life, what these are and what they're producing. And so, and again, this is why I find the Cursor flow so much more superior, because I do actually have to review the code. And if I can incrementally review it as it's going through and I can interrupt and do all these things, I think that's important. Like, I'll tell you, when I was hiring our CTO, one of these things you do when you hire executives is usually have them give some kind of like pitch, or like go through a deck of some random shenanigans. You've probably done this with folks you've hired. And I'm like, I hate this, because they're always so just useless, basically. And so I'm like, you know what I want them to do? Because I still want to understand, can they storytell? Can they engage in stuff? And sort of these things you test. I'm like, I want them to just give a pitch on something that they're interested in, like a short presentation and Q&A and stuff. And our CTO previously worked at Apple for a period of time on the autonomous car division. And he was interested, or at least wanted to do it on just self-driving cars. And I'm like, that's cool. Nothing to do with Sentry. I don't care.
Yep, definitely cool though.
And one statement he made, I super agree with, is the problem right now is everybody, and sort of maybe his take was Apple did this wrong, is like they just wanted to go full self-driving all the way to automation, which you see this in the LLMs too. Like, everybody's like wants to believe that agents can just run on their own. And the right answer is like humans should be in the loop. And I think Cursor's user experience, for example, is a much better version of humans in the loop, because I incrementally review things. So the context for me is smaller. I have it in the surrounding context. I can see the source code. It's a flow I understand. I don't build software through a log in the terminal. Like, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to use things that way, except if you had full autonomy, which I just don't see.
Yeah.
like,
happening.
I
Yeah.
don't see the technology we have today getting to full autonomy by any remote, and it could, who knows? Like, that's the academic part. Maybe it can get there. I don't think they know either, to be clear, but,
Yeah.
and I think that's really important though. It's like, you can't pretend these things can do things they can't do. And you need a human in the loop. And it's like, well, what's the best experience if you have to have a human in the loop? To me, it's not generate a bunch of stuff, then go to GitHub and review it, and then
Yeah.
go back and refine it over and over. And to me, it's not have it running in a terminal over here and have the editor over here and then click around file. It's just, they're not, they're high friction experiences.
I super interesting. And I guess, again, like maybe back to the we're all experimenting here, nobody knows on it. I do wonder about the definition of the guardrails. So I guess in Tessl, like there's a bunch of words you were doing that made me tempted to sort of mention Tessl in those where you're saying, you write a spec at the beginning on it. Like clearly that's like our core premises. That should be your sort of the primary artifact in your project. And actually we have these kind of levels of autonomy levels of a unit of software and modeled after self-driving cars and thinking about sort of the 5 levels of autonomy. So we'll kind of write that up and publish it soon enough. But within that context, one of the premises is, well, one of the things that would make you not need to review it is if you have good tests. And so if your definitions for the things that you've built are covered or sort of backed by tests, and you trust the tests, which by the way don't get in the way of the IDE commentary. That's a different place of a human in the loop. But once you've defined those, then to those you don't really need to get back. And I guess I'm curious on whether that resonates and whether I guess how did your kind of relationship with tests change or play a role as you were sort of avoiding the coding? Was it like, I'm trying to get you to understand something that I'm doing here, and the way to convey that is that this test needs to pass?
Yeah. I mean, my rule was I cannot edit the code myself. So it was quite complicated. I'm a big test guy. I don't do TDD, if you will. That is like, I don't write the test before writing the code. But I don't test the code manually, ever, if I can avoid it. And this is my entire career. I refuse to manually test code if I can avoid it. And then we are in the reality where UI is ever present and UI is more code than ever, and good luck kind of thing. It's like a real problem. If you've ever worked in JavaScript, like you cannot test things. Like end to end is impossible. It's like really, really difficult to get it working. Test harnesses are hard. Most people don't actually test things in an effective way. And so I do have a bunch of tests. I've even written like, if you use TypeScript in Vitest, I wrote an evals adapter that just implements an evals spec, but does it through the test because I need CI to be CI. Like that, again, technology doesn't change. We still need the same validation layer. But I'm like, okay, I needed to generate the test. And what I will tell you, what's really impressive, if you can get a really simple system. And so I'm using this technology called ORPC, which is like it's like a JavaScript API binding layer, like a server side thing that also has a client side binding, but that doesn't matter. But the server side is so easy to reason about as a human and as a machine, of course, because if it's easy for a human, it's easy for a machine to pattern match against it. I was able to code generate an entire migration from one technology to the other because the API is so simple to reason about. And I was able to generate tests for that, and was able to validate everything because everything was simple. It was clear. It was not a lot of boilerplate. And I think that's a really important concept, because what I think happens over the next few years, fingers crossed, because we need this, is a lot of this complexity goes away, and we return to spending time solving real problems. Because a lot of what's happened in my industry, which I live in this JavaScript world these days, it's just infinite complexity. I don't see the value gain we've gotten as an industry out of it. I don't see better software, more reliable software, faster to ship software. I see more complicated software, things that are not commonplace being like front and center. And I see people not writing tests. I see people not understanding core systems design. And I got to believe this is going to reconcile that, because again, there's no magic in these. The simpler the sort of technology stack that they're working with, the better it is for humans. The easier for us to write code, the easier it is going to be for them to debug, to build all this stuff. And so I'm very hopeful that this just implicitly creates more value, and that just like it's implicitly creating more value in specs, in documentation and stuff, which despite what people would like to believe, are actually not that valuable to humans, because we learn context and retain it really, really well. So you go to a new code base, you might read some onboarding docs. You're not going back to the docs ever. You don't need to read them ever again. You just look at the code and you know what's going on. But like the docs are actually super valuable to the LLMs because they don't retain context, And so it's just really interesting how the same things that have always been sort of important to software design or at least as important now, if not more important.
Right. Yeah. No, I love that. I guess I love both of those points. One is this notion of retaining context versus not. Like agents, they retain context. They're also more disciplined in that sense, which is, there's all these sort of running jokes of like, we wouldn't write docs for our teammates, but we do for the agents. And, the obvious reply being, yeah, because the agents actually read them.
Yeah.
But beyond the sort of the snarky version of it, you're making a good point, which is like, as humans, we're maybe better at remembering the things that are salient, while the LLMs don't. And the other is this notion of adaptability. I think a lot about adaptable software, and I think your point around JavaScript and the mess is like much of that is because of the interweaving of the implementation details and browsers changing over time and all these subtleties and supporting the sort of infinite sort of stream of historical ones, and overcoming the natural way that browsers evolve is they see these quirky patterns and then they create a new way to make it simple and make it clean. But then you have all these historical websites that do not have that. And so it's nice to think that it did that higher level abstraction into natural language will reduce that because LLMs can provide adaptability. I'd love to take it a little bit into the broader team and maybe ecosystem, in our sort of last 10-ish minutes here, and just talk. So you've taken the plunge, right? You've sort of subjected yourself to these sort of 8 weeks of non-coding and building with it, and you have a bunch of these learnings around how do you interact with them. What is it, if you think today and tomorrow, which of these practices would you recommend? And you're probably not just recommending, but like actually driving the broader Sentry development team would use, right? I'm using that really as a proxy, of course, for a dev team today to build. What should they do? Let's split those up. It's like, what should do you want to see the entire team do today? And then we'll talk about, what do you think tomorrow?
Yeah. Well, okay. So I think the first problem is, this is unrelated to Sentry because we've solved this. You need to be able to use these tools, and you really need your workplace to enable consumption of these tools. Like a month or something ago, I took away compliance on IP at Sentry in the sense of we no longer consider source code protected. Like that doesn't mean we want to enforce our license. I will come after you if you steal our code, to be clear. But what I mean is like, I don't care if, say, Cursor accidentally fucks up and leaks our source code. Well, one, it's already public, whatever. We don't care. But I'm also not worried about, I'm not saying Cursor would ever do this, to be clear, but some people will, as we've already seen this in the industry. I'm not worried about them training on our data. I'm not going to necessarily say they can, but if they do the shenanigan that some of the model providers are doing, where they're like, we're just going to ask for forgiveness later, we don't consider that a risk to the business anymore. And that was a 24-hour decision that I just made that was really, really important to the company because instantly it allowed us to adopt a bunch of tools. Right. Not everybody can do that, so that's hard. But you need to really have a workplace that can enable these, or you're paying out of pocket quite a lot, which I also do, to do these on your side projects. But you need to be able to use them. I think, and that's the first and foremost thing. And so, and that is what I'm pushing at Sentry. I did this and I'm like, folks, tell me what tools you want. I'm not going to give most of them to you because they're garbage and they don't solve problems, and you can't just have infinite tools. And customer data is still a separate concern. But you need to use the tools. And so we gave access to Claude Code and Cursor to everybody in the company. We gave ChatGPT to everybody in the company. There's probably some other valuable tools, but it's about like most bang for your buck and what's most important to start learning. And so I think that's number one. Beyond that, this has been hard. So the biggest challenge you'll face is this archetype of like a senior engineer that's maybe not pessimistic, but roughly pessimistic. Cynical, that tries one of the, cynical. Cynical is the better word. And I am this, to be clear. They open a prompt, they type something, and it produces garbage. And then they're like, see, it doesn't work, And yes, it doesn't work. Yeah. And despite what anybody wants to believe, it will not work that way. And so you got to get past, and you got to force people past that point. Be like, yes, it's not going to work. This is how you make it work. And that needs to be like a self-feeding cycle of everybody teaching each other, because the name of the game is just to give it all the information it needs to succeed. And I like to explain this to people, which is like, if you don't tell it the facts, it will not be able to answer the question. You have to give it the answer right then and there. And then you'll look at it and you'll be like, that makes no sense. Then why don't I do the work myself? And it's like, well, what you're giving it is like the page from the docs or something. It's like, you're not actually writing that or giving it that, but you're like, here's the URL, go fetch it and then go do the thing, right? You have to still feed it all of this information to set it up for success. And that's something, yes, that's obvious if you just reason about how the thing works, but also you just like, very quickly come to understand as you try to use it too.
Right.
And then you see wildly different results. And so I think it's really like, use it as much as possible, really learn how, like what kinds of context it needs and how to pass it in, and then find ways to do that. So a really cool experiment we've been running down is like, can we expose all of our docs in a useful way? So there's this MCP provider that I think is really interesting called Context 7. I haven't used it, but what it does is take a bunch of like, I think roughly open source projects and stuff and expose the docs over MCP, because you can't just like, these things don't know software. They don't know the random things you're using. They don't know the APIs. They're just guessing. And that's what people don't understand. It's just pattern matching. And you actually have to feed it the right docs for the right library. And sometimes it'll look in the source code or whatever. But so we've taken our public docs, so Sentry's docs at sentry.io. We've generated markdown files that are sort of cleaned up. And so it's like we generate a markdown file for every single page that's at like a dedicated URL that gets rid of a lot of the layout stuff. It gets rid of some other elements. And you can think of this like LLMs.txt, but that's not really a thing that matters in the world. We took this and then we exposed it to our MCP via some tools. One is a search docs tool and one is a get docs tool that basically allows it to find the relevant documentation and pull it down. And we did this in the context of like, oh, we actually want to build some agents that will help you instrument code. And it doesn't brilliantly if you can make docs work. But we're also running an experiment, like, could we do this for internal development where we can make our docs available and it can fetch the right information at the right time with slightly less input from a human? And I actually think those investments are going to be very, very good in terms of like, again, these go back to the core things that make development better is like we are building better docs or better specs or something. And we actually have a reason to consume them now. And so I would definitely invest in those kinds of things. But again, I think your results are going to be super anecdotal and not scientific. And, you know, if you will, you're like vibe check these things. I hate that terminology for what it's worth, but like there is no better analogy. Like you actually don't know if it's better or worse when you do something.
Going on vibes. Yeah, it is. It's not a great term, but it's actually like a fairly great term, and like it's descriptive to what you're doing.
Yeah.
I guess kind of on that note, that's what I was going to ask, which is like how much do you expect to see results and kind of real world impact today versus how much are you doing this out of conviction of I'm building a muscle that I think will be impactful, not in 3 years time, but maybe in 6 months time or 12 months time?
So I think it's both. So I'll give you a real quick anecdote of like why I think this is impactful today. And it has been for months. I started off like when Cursor had just started and it was mostly just type ahead. I'm like, folks, it's just type ahead. There's no magic here. And I tried it. And I think that like Composer, which is their agent, was still very new. And I'm like, okay, look, I'm going to try to not be cynical. And I'm cynical by default because like crypto bros and like the whole internet is full of people grifting all the time, right? And so cynical by default is actually a totally reasonable way to be in life. But I'm like, okay, I'll try it. I tried Cursor. And I went through a normal workflow. A normal workflow in any company in the world that if you are serious is like, I have an API or something like that looks the same as all the other APIs. I need to build another one, or I need to build another thing that looks exactly the same as all the other things, right? Like that is like software engineering in a nutshell. And so I'm like, okay, I did that, but I tried to do it using Composer and stuff. So I'm like, okay, I need to build this. Here's an existing one that you can model it off of. And it roughly did it. And then I'm like, okay, and I need to generate a test. Here's an existing one. And it roughly did it. In fact, the test it did better than I would do because it added additional branches that I probably would not cover just because I don't care because they're like not the common case, you know?
It's not,
exactly.
It's less lazy than the developer.
Yeah. But it was successful. And it was basically what I would have done. It copy pasted the file. It changed a bunch of stuff to match the new thing. That would have been my flow. And I'd roughly time myself like how long this would take me versus how long it took me to do almost an identical task through this. And it was significantly faster. Like I was able to get like 2 to 3 times more output from that. That is not the same as prompting Claude Code to build stuff for you, to be clear.
Right.
That was me like using the agent to do boilerplate work.
Right.
That, and this is months ago, that was already super effective. The type ahead super effective. So I think value's been there already, but it's a different thing. But what I will tell you also is there is an implicit value that is happening right now that is not talked about as much. People like me, a couple founders that we acquired the companies of that one's newer, but he's the same persona, I'm sure. But this one founder at Sentry, his name's Indrajit, got interested in this. For a long time at Sentry, he's been kind of managing teams, if you will. Like kind of like me at Sentry, not really writing code for the company. And this piqued his interest, as a lot of us it is. And now he's back in the weeds. He's building stuff and whatnot. That is not talked about as much, but that is like
Right.
so unbelievably important.
Yeah.
And you see this persona of people that are builders, that are curious about technology, like the core people, in my opinion, that drive this industry are now like back in the weeds. They are excited about change, because for a long time, this industry's kind of been stagnant. It's like the big companies own the world. There's not much you can do about it. We solve most of the hard problems, in all honesty. And so I think that's like a really, really important thing. And a lot of this comes from like this excitement and this passion and whatnot, which leads to like genuine ROI in businesses, because it leads to thought, I guess, if you will. That's like immeasurable in my opinion. And that's a really important thing, that you just got to enable people to dig in the technology. And what it translates to for people like me is like, I will happily, my wife less happy about this but I will happily spend my evenings working on random things, because I'm like actually excited about technology again, you know, and again, immeasurable, but like unbelievably important. And so I think you get all of these things, some practical value right now today, if people understand how to use the tech today, and some sort of value that's hard to really analyze from people, sort of how they think, how they make decisions.
Spending their time more on the sort of the deep thinking on it, and you might produce the same lines of code. Like, it's going to be hard to doing it. They would just sort of be better, and maybe you also just energized.
Well, I think energized and like
would otherwise like be sort of a bit tired of the grunt work.
But I think it's also like, you have people in your company that make decisions. Doesn't matter where they are in the stack of your company. The more they can see what is happening in the world of like technology trends and stuff, the better they're going to make decisions, period. That's just a source of data, right? And this has always been my strength at Sentry, is like, I am always in the weeds. I will always have strong signal out of data. Data is not surveys and shit, by the way. Data is like me living the world. And that's the value I see, is like, people are like in the weeds again, which just means they have better opinions. They have taste. They have all these things that are just like so important to building like great products and great companies. And so that is like the most important thing about getting people involved in using the technology. But again, you can also get speed ups if you just use it in a way that's rational. So
yeah. And you build those out. I think, well, there's like a dozen more questions I want to ask you, but I think we're out of time. I'll ask one more sort of quick one for the broader audience here. We've kind of gone from your practices to sort of development teams as a whole, and how do you build them for the individual, right? If you're a developer out there and you see the transformation to your own profession happening, I guess what's the primary tip that you would give someone in this stage, right? Like, what's to like do's or don'ts to adapt?
I would just say, embrace it. Embrace it. It's fair to be skeptical. Don't listen to everything on the internet. Don't listen to any CEOs of big companies that are like spewing out nonsense. But yeah, just embrace it. Like, it's not removing engineering or any of this hogwash that's going on in the world. Like, I do just as much engineering now as before, if not more. But just embrace it. Like, you can't ignore it. If you ignore it, you're dead. Like, dead in the water from a career point of view, from a company point of view. You can't ignore anything that's happening right now. I think that's evident with how every single company in the world has shifted in this direction. And they are very smart people running those companies. So, but yeah, just embrace it. Embrace it. Find a way to like spend time using the technology. Ideally, you can do it for work. If not, maybe find a job where you can. I'm not sure. So, but yeah.
No, good tip. Very aligned with my view on it. You can't deny it, and you need to build up the muscle, even if you're not feeling the return of it immediately. Hey, David, thanks again for all the insights, the learnings of it. Looking forward to continuing to hear your opinions. I love the sort of the sound bites and such you put out on the social media and the conversations of it. And yeah, there's a pioneering space. So keep on doing it, and looking forward to hearing more learnings.
Cool. Yeah, awesome.
And thanks everybody for tuning in, and I hope you join us for the next one.